Hey there, welcome to Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. In the sprawling, sun-drenched metropolis of Sao Paulo, a city of staggering wealth and desperate poverty, the von Richthofen name was synonymous with success. It was a name that carried the distant, aristocratic echo of its most famous bearer, the World War I flying ace Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. In Brazil, the name belonged to Manfred Albert von Richthofen, a brilliant German engineer who had immigrated and built a life of extraordinary privilege. He was a director at Dersa, the state-owned highway company, the chief engineer for the city's massive ring road project, and a man whose declared net worth ran into the millions. He, his wife Marija, a respected psychiatrist, and their 2 children, Suzanne and Andreas, lived in a sprawling mansion in Brooklyn, Belho, one of Sao Paulo's most exclusive neighborhoods. Theirs was a life lived behind high walls and secure gates, a gilded cage of immense comfort and high expectations. At the center of this perfect world was Suzanne Louise von Richthofen. Born in 1983, she was the golden child, a pretty, blonde-haired girl who seemed to have everything. She attended a prestigious German high school, she was fluent in multiple languages, and she was enrolled as a law student at one of the city's top universities. To the outside world, she was the very picture of a dutiful, intelligent, and privileged daughter, destined to follow the successful path her parents had so carefully laid out for her. But beneath the placid surface of this idyllic family portrait, currents of discord were beginning to stir. The von Richthofen household was one of strict discipline and emotional distance. Manfred was a demanding father, a man who showed little affection and expected unquestioning obedience. Suzanne, entering womanhood, was beginning to feel the constraints of her gilded cage. She was a young woman with a budding rebellious streak, a yearning for a freedom that was not on her parents' carefully curated agenda. In the summer of 1999, that yearning found a name and a face. He was Daniel Cravinhos de Paulo e Silva. He was handsome, charming, and from a world away from the manicured lawns of Brooklyn, Belho. Daniel came from a working-class background. He had little interest in school or a conventional career, and he was a habitual marijuana user. He entered the von Richthofen's orbit as an instructor for their son Andreas's model airplane hobby. When Suzanne met him, the attraction was immediate and intense. He was everything her life was not, unstructured, uninhibited, and thrillingly dangerous. Their relationship blossomed in secret. Manfred and Marija, upon discovering the romance, were unequivocal in their disapproval. Daniel was not the kind of man they envisioned for their daughter. They saw him as a shiftless, unmotivated user who was beneath their social station. But their opposition only served to fan the flames of Suzanne's infatuation. The more they pushed her away from Daniel, the more fiercely she clung to him. He became her rebellion, her escape, her cause. In July of 2002, while her parents were on vacation, Suzanne took the defiant step of moving Daniel into the family home. When they returned, the confrontation was explosive. Suzanne, defiant, suggested they buy her an apartment where she and Daniel could live together. Her father refused, his words cold and final. She could do as she pleased, but only when she was earning her own money. The battle lines were drawn. Suzanne, forced to choose between her family's world and Daniel's, began to formulate a plan. It was a plan of such monstrous, unthinkable cruelty that it would forever etch her name into the annals of Brazil's most disturbing crimes. She would not choose between the 2 worlds. She would simply eliminate one of them. The night of October 31st, 2002, was Halloween, a night when the veil between worlds is said to be at its thinnest, a night for masks and monsters. In the quiet, opulent von Richthofen mansion, a real-life monster was about to be unleashed. The plan, which Suzanne had been meticulously crafting for months, was set to be put into motion. That evening, Manfred and Marija von Richthofen retired to their bedroom, unaware that they were spending their final hours in the home they had so carefully built. Downstairs, Suzanne waited. The house was quiet, the only sound the gentle hum of the air conditioning. She moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost, her heart a cold, steady drum in her chest. Sometime after midnight, she confirmed her parents were asleep. Then, with a chilling deliberation, she disconnected the estate's sophisticated alarm system. She walked to the front door, turned the lock, and opened it to the warm, dark night. Waiting outside were Daniel Kravinhos, then 21, and his older brother, Christian, 26. They had been enlisted as the instruments of Suzanne's dark will, seduced by the promise of the von Richthofen fortune, a prize they believed would be theirs for the taking once the old couple was out of the way. The two brothers, armed with heavy iron bars, slipped into the silent house. Suzanne, her part in the initial stage of the plan complete, retreated to the living room, a silent, waiting accomplice to the slaughter she had orchestrated. The Kravinhos brothers crept up the grand staircase and into the master bedroom. Manfred and Marija lay sleeping, vulnerable and unsuspecting. The attack was swift and brutally efficient. The brothers raised the iron bars and brought them down upon the sleeping couple's heads. The sickening thud of metal against bone echoed in the quiet room. To ensure the job was done, they then strangled their victims with towels, extinguishing the last vestiges of life. With the murders accomplished, the trio moved to the second phase of their plan, the cover-up. They moved through the house with a cold, calculated theatricality, staging the scene to look like a burglary gone horribly wrong. They ransacked the library, spreading papers on the floor with an almost artistic regularity that would later strike investigators as deeply suspicious. They pocketed a sum of money they found, a prop for their fictional narrative of a robbery. Their grisly work done, the three conspirators dispersed. Christian went to a fast food restaurant, a banal end to a night of horrific violence. Suzanne and Daniel, in a final, chilling act of performative normalcy, drove to a nearby motel, seeking to create an alibi that placed them far from the scene of the crime. As dawn broke over Sao Paulo, they began the final act of their macabre play. They drove to an internet cafe to pick up Suzanne's younger brother, Andreas, then just 15 years old. The three of them then returned to the mansion to discover the crime. It was Suzanne who made the call to the police, her voice a carefully calibrated instrument of feigned shock and horror. The performance had begun. When the first police officers arrived at the von Richthofen mansion, they were met with a scene of apparent chaos and a story of tragic loss. A beautiful, distraught young woman told them a story of a break-in, of a robbery that had turned deadly. But to the seasoned eyes of the investigators, something was profoundly wrong. The ransacking of the library looked staged, the papers scattered too neatly. The alarm system, they quickly discovered, had not been breached, it had been turned off from within. And then there was Suzanne herself. Her grief, her shock, it all felt hollow, a poorly rehearsed performance. In the hours and days that followed the murders, her behavior grew from merely suspicious to utterly damning. The day after her parents' brutal slaughter, she was seen laughing and swimming in the family pool with Daniel. Just hours after her parents' funeral, a somber event that had gripped the nation, Suzanne was celebrating her 19th birthday with a party for her friends. Her emotional detachment was so profound, so chillingly inappropriate, that it sent a signal to the investigators that was as clear as a confession. This was not the behavior of a grieving daughter. This was the behavior of a sociopath. The investigators' focus immediately sharpened on Suzanne and her working-class boyfriend. They began to tail the young couple, listening to their conversations, watching their every move. The cover story of the random burglary began to fray at the edges, and then it unraveled completely. The break came from the weakest link in the conspiracy, Christian Kravinhos. A few days after the murders, Christian, a man of modest means, made a purchase he could not possibly afford. He bought a brand new motorcycle, paying for it in cash, with a thick wad of crisp $100 bills. It was a fatally stupid mistake, a flaunting of newfound wealth that immediately caught the attention of the police. On November 9, 2002, just 9 days after the murders, the police made their move. They arrested Christian Kravinhos. His story quickly crumbled. He confessed, and his confession led them directly to his brother and to the mastermind of the entire plot. Daniel and Suzanne were taken into custody. Faced with the evidence, with the collapse of her carefully constructed lies, Suzanne confessed. She admitted to planning and orchestrating the murder of her parents. The golden child of one of Brazil's wealthiest families, the pretty blonde law student, was a cold-blooded parricide. The news exploded across Brazil, a story of betrayal so shocking, so monstrous, that it seemed to defy comprehension. The nation was captivated and horrified in equal measure. The stage was now set for a trial that would become one of the most sensational in the country's history. The trial of Suzanne von Richthofen and the Cravinhos brothers, which began in July 2006, was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a national spectacle. The courtroom in São Paulo was a pressure cooker of media, public, and raw emotion. The case had touched a nerve in Brazilian society, a story that encompassed class, greed, rebellion, and the darkest corners of the human heart. The prosecution, led by the fiery Roberto Tardelli, painted a portrait of Suzanne as a cold, manipulative, and utterly evil young woman. He branded her the mastermind of the crime, a diabolical puppeteer who had used her hold over Daniel to orchestrate the murder of her parents for one simple, brutal reason: money. Tardelli argued that Suzanne, tired of waiting for her inheritance, had decided to seize it. She wanted to get her hands on the money and assets her parents had worked so hard to obtain, he told the court. She wanted her freedom and independence without having to work for it. He dismissed any notion that her actions were motivated by a desperate love, portraying her instead as a personification of the evil blonde, a chillingly effective label that would stick to her forever. The defense strategies were a tangled web of blame and counterblame. Suzanne's lawyer argued that she had no motive, that she was a pawn in Daniel's game, a young woman so besotted with her older, more worldly boyfriend that she was forced into a crime that was not of her own making. Suzanne, taking the stand, blamed Daniel for everything, her testimony a carefully constructed performance of a victimized, love-struck girl. The Cravinhos brothers, in turn, pointed the finger directly back at Suzanne. They claimed they had acted solely on her wishes, that they were the instruments of her murderous will. Their defense also tried to muddy the waters by making lurid, unsubstantiated claims against the victims. They alleged that Manfred von Richthofen had abused his daughter, and that both he and Marija were alcoholics, claims that Suzanne herself denied, and which were disproven by autopsy reports that showed no alcohol in her parents' systems. The trial was a theater of accusation. The three defendants, once united in their deadly conspiracy, were now locked in a desperate battle to save themselves, their testimonies a toxic mixture of lies, half-truths, and betrayals. The prosecution methodically dismantled their conflicting stories, presenting the jury with the overwhelming evidence of a meticulously planned crime. On July 22, 2006, after a trial that had held the nation spellbound for weeks, the jury delivered its verdict. Suzanne von Richthofen was found guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 40 years in prison, a sentence later reduced to 39 years and 6 months. Daniel Cravinhos received the same sentence, and his brother Christian was sentenced to 38 years for his role in the conspiracy. The verdict was met with a wave of public approval. Justice, it seemed, had been served. The evil blonde was going to prison. Suzanne von Richthofen's life behind bars was as sensational and turbulent as the crime that had put her there. In a strange twist, she became a kind of dark celebrity within the Brazilian prison system. In 2014, she entered into a relationship with another inmate, Sandra Regina Ruiz Gomez, known as Sandro, who was serving a sentence for the kidnapping and murder of a teenager. Their relationship caused a stir, not least because Sandro's ex-girlfriend was Elise Matsuniga, another of Brazil's most infamous female murderers, who was in the same prison for killing and dismembering her husband. The three women all worked in the prison's sewing workshop, with Suzanne, in a bizarre echo of her crime's narrative, in the position of boss. After years of legal appeals and requests for a more lenient prison regime, on January 11, 2023, after serving 20 years of her sentence, Suzanne von Richthofen was released on parole. The news of her release sparked outrage and reignited the public's fascination with her case. She initially moved to the rural town of Angatuba, attempting to live a quiet life out of the public eye. But the shadow of her crime was long, and she soon relocated to Braganca Paulista. In a development that seemed to defy belief, she began a relationship with a doctor, Felipe Zucchini Muniz. She became pregnant, and in January 2024, she gave birth to a son, whom she named Felipe. In an attempt to finally shed the name that had become synonymous with parricide, in December 2023, she legally changed her name to Suzanne Louise Magnani Muniz, taking her maternal grandmother's surname and her new partner's. Today, Suzanne von Richthofen, the woman who masterminded the murder of her own parents for a life of freedom and wealth she did not want to earn, is, by all accounts, a free woman. She is a mother, a partner, an entrepreneur who has started an online business. She is attempting to build a new life, to reintegrate into a society that has never forgotten, and will likely never forgive, her monstrous betrayal. The story of Suzanne von Richthofen remains a chilling cautionary tale, a story not of a monster who emerged from the shadows, but of one who was born and raised in a gilded cage. A young woman who, faced with a choice between duty and desire, chose to burn her entire world to the ground. Story 2. In the autumn of 2021, the house on Clover Drive in Jonesboro, Arkansas, was a place of quiet domesticity. It was the home of Sabrina Benson, a 42-year-old woman whose life was a tapestry woven with the threads of family, friendship, and a love she believed was her future. At the center of that life was her fiancé, Shadrach "Shad" Ward. At 38, Shad was a man with a complicated past, a man whose life had been a landscape of trouble with the law. But to Sabrina, he was the man she loved, the man with whom she was building a future. Theirs was a relationship that, to the outside world, seemed settled, a comfortable partnership between two people navigating the middle passage of their lives. But beneath the placid surface of their shared home, a different reality was taking shape, a darkness that was gathering in the quiet corners of the house. It was a darkness born of secrets and a simmering rage, a pressure that was building, unseen by the world, until it could no longer be contained. Sabrina Benson, a woman who had given her heart to a man with a troubled past, had no way of knowing that she was living with a monster, a man whose love was a mask for a violence so profound it would ultimately demand her life. In the late autumn of that year, the quiet house on Clover Drive was about to become a crime scene, and a secret, held for a time in the cold silence of a lie, was about to be buried. Sunday, November 21st, 2021, began like any other weekend day. Shad and Sabrina had a few friends over. The house was filled with the easy sounds of conversation and laughter, the comfortable camaraderie of a casual get-together. They were drinking, a typical Sunday afternoon pastime. As the day wore on, the friends departed, leaving Sabrina and Shad alone in the quiet of their home. The afternoon bled into evening, and the house on Clover Drive fell silent. That silence was shattered by a frantic 911 call. It was Shadrach Ward. His voice was laced with a panicked urgency. He told the dispatcher that something was terribly wrong with his fiancée. He had heard her call his name, he said, and when he went to check on her, he had found her lying unconscious on the floor of the hallway. The first responders, officers from the Jonesboro Police Department, arrived to a scene of quiet, controlled chaos. They found Sabrina Benson exactly where Shad had said she would be, a still, unresponsive figure on the hallway floor. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no visible wounds, nothing to suggest that this was anything other than a tragic medical emergency. Shad, distraught and seemingly cooperative, repeated his story. They had been drinking. He had found her unconscious. The initial theory, in the minds of the officers on the scene, began to form around a plausible, if tragic, explanation: alcohol poisoning, or perhaps a sudden, catastrophic medical event like an aneurysm or a heart attack. Sabrina was rushed to the nearby NEA Baptist Hospital, but it was too late. Shortly after her arrival, she was pronounced dead. A life had been extinguished, but the reason why remained a mystery. The Craighead County Deputy Coroner, upon examining Sabrina's body, could not determine a cause of death. The outward signs were simply not there. In cases like this, where the why is shrouded in uncertainty, there is only one path forward. Sabrina's body was sent to the Arkansas State Crime Lab for a full and comprehensive autopsy, a scientific investigation that would, it was hoped, give a voice to the secrets her body held. In the days and weeks that followed, the case of Sabrina Benson's death was a frustrating question mark. With no clear evidence of foul play, the investigation was in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the final word from the medical examiner. Shadrach Ward, the grieving fiancé, was not a suspect. He was a victim of circumstance, a man who had tragically lost the woman he loved. Or so it seemed. The truth, buried deep within the cells and tissues of Sabrina's body, was waiting for the cold, clear light of science to bring it into view. The silence that had fallen over the house on Clover Drive was about to be broken by a forensic whisper that would grow into a roar of accusation. For 3 long months, the case of Sabrina Benson's death lay dormant, a question mark in the files of the Jonesboro Police Department. The initial story told by Shadrach Ward, a tragic, unexplained collapse after a day of drinking, was the only narrative they had. It was a story that, on its face, was plausible. But for the investigators, particularly Detective Bill Brown, it was a story that didn't quite sit right. The lack of any clear explanation was a loose thread, and Detective Brown was a man who knew how to pull on a thread. He was waiting patiently for the results from the state crime lab, for the science that would either confirm Ward's story or blow it to pieces. In February of 2022, the call finally came. The full autopsy report was complete, and its findings were a bombshell. The forensic pathologists had uncovered a truth that was invisible to the naked eye, a story of violence written in the subtle, microscopic language of trauma. First, they had found petechial hemorrhaging in Sabrina's eyes, tiny burst blood vessels that are a classic, telltale sign of asphyxiation or strangulation. The pressure required to produce such an injury is immense, a clear indication of a violent, sustained assault. But that was not all. The pathologists had also discovered bruising on the sides and back of her head, and more bruising around her neck, injuries consistent with both blunt force trauma and strangulation. This was not a woman who had simply collapsed. This was a woman who had been attacked, brutally, and with lethal force. And then came the final, damning piece of the forensic puzzle. The toxicology report revealed that there were no significant drugs or alcohol in Sabrina's system at the time of her death. The story of a day spent drinking heavily, the very foundation of Shadrach Ward's narrative, was a lie. The cause of death was now clear, and it was homicide. Sabrina Benson had been strangled to death. The mystery of her sudden, unexplained death was solved. But a new, more sinister mystery had taken its place. Who had done it? For Detective Brown, the answer was as clear as the autopsy report in his hand. There was only one person who had been there, only one person whose story was now a transparent fabrication. The focus of the investigation turned, with a laser-like intensity, on the grieving fiancé, Shadrach Ward. But there was a complication. Shadrach Ward was not at home. He was already in jail. His life, a chaotic cycle of run-ins with the law, had caught up with him on unrelated matters. He had been arrested as a habitual offender, and he was being held at the Craighead County Detention Center. His incarceration meant that Detective Brown knew exactly where to find him. On February 21st, 2022, 3 months to the day after Sabrina's death, Detective Brown walked into an interrogation room at the county jail. The time for waiting was over. The time for questions, for hard questions backed by the irrefutable power of science, had arrived. The interrogation room at the Craighead County Detention Center was a small, sterile box, a place where lies come to die. When Shadrach Ward was led into the room, he was a man already stripped of his freedom. He was about to be stripped of his secrets as well. He sat across from Detective Bill Brown, a man who now held the truth of what had happened on that November day. The interview began calmly. Detective Brown asked Ward to recount the events of November 21st, 2021. Ward, his face a mask of practiced grief, repeated the story he had told so many times before. They had friends over, they were drinking, he had found her on the floor. It was a story he had clearly rehearsed, a narrative he believed was his shield. But then, Detective Brown began to push. He confronted Ward with the findings of the autopsy. He told him about the petechial hemorrhaging, the bruising on her head and neck, the undeniable signs of strangulation. He told him about the toxicology report, the scientific proof that his story of a day of heavy drinking was a fiction. As the weight of the forensic evidence was laid before him, Ward's composure began to crack. The shield of his lies was being dismantled, piece by piece. The practiced grief on his face gave way to a new expression, the cornered look of a man who knows the game is up. His story began to change. He abandoned the tale of finding her collapsed. He now admitted that they had gotten into an argument. The reason for the argument, he claimed, was trivial. He had wanted to leave the house to go drinking with some friends, and she had not wanted him to go. It was a common, everyday disagreement, the kind of friction that exists in any relationship. But in the hands of a man with a simmering rage, that friction had ignited a firestorm. He claimed that Sabrina had come at him or charged him, a desperate attempt to cast himself as the victim, to frame his actions as a form of self-defense. And then came the confession, the words that finally, irrevocably, laid bare the truth of what had happened in the hallway of the house on Clover Drive. He admitted that he had grabbed her with both of his hands around her neck. He admitted that he had squeezed, that he had held on, that he had not let go until she went limp, until she lost consciousness, until the life had been choked out of her. It was a confession born not of remorse, but of the cold, hard reality of irrefutable scientific fact. He had not confessed because of a guilty conscience. He had confessed because he had been caught. The forensic whisper from the state crime lab had become a roar of accusation that he could no longer deny. 2 days after his confession, the legal consequences of his actions came crashing down. Shadrach Ward was officially charged with the murder of his fiancée, Sabrina Benson. A judge, recognizing the brutal nature of the crime and Ward's extensive criminal history, set his bond at a staggering $5 million, a sum that ensured he would remain behind bars. The man who had, for 3 months, hidden his guilt behind a mask of grief was now facing the full weight of the law. The search for the truth was over. The fight for justice had just begun. In February of 2024, more than 2 years after he had choked the life out of his fiancée, Shadrach Ward finally faced a jury of his peers. The trial, held in the Craighead County Circuit Court with Judge Scott Ellington presiding, was a methodical presentation of a crime that was as brutal as it was senseless. The prosecution, led by Chief Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Jessica Thomason and Deputy Prosecuting Attorney Charlene Davidson, laid out the state's case with a chilling clarity. They painted a picture of a man whose lies had been systematically dismantled by science. They presented the detailed findings of the autopsy, explaining to the jury the significance of the petechial hemorrhaging, the bruising, the irrefutable physical evidence that Sabrina Benson had been strangled to death. And then they presented the jury with the most damning evidence of all, Ward's own words, his confession to Detective Bill Brown, an admission that he had, with his own 2 hands, ended the life of the woman he was supposed to love and protect. Ward's defense team, public defenders Matthew Lund and Joseph Hughes, were faced with an almost insurmountable task. They could not dispute the cause of death. They could not dispute the confession. Their only path was to try and mitigate the circumstances, to argue that this was not a premeditated act of murder, but a spontaneous act of violence, a tragic outcome of an argument that had spun out of control. They tried to lean on Ward's claim that Sabrina had charged him, to suggest that he had acted, in some twisted way, in self-defense. But the narrative of a man defending himself by strangling a woman to death was a story that strained credulity to its breaking point. The jury listened to the evidence, to the arguments, to the cold, hard facts of a life taken and a lie told. Their deliberation was not a long one. On Thursday, February 15, 2024, they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase followed quickly. The jury, having found him guilty of the murder, also had to consider his long and storied criminal past. Shadrach Ward was a habitual offender, a man for whom the justice system was a revolving door. The jury sentenced him to 70 years in the Arkansas Department of Correction for the murder of Sabrina Benson. On top of that, they sentenced him to an additional 18 years for a probation revocation. The judge ordered that he must serve the entire 18-year sentence, and then at least 70% of the 70-year sentence for the murder before he could even be considered for parole. The math was simple and stark. Shadrach Ward, who was 38 at the time of his arrest, would be at least 86 years old before he would ever have a chance to walk free again. It was, for all intents and purposes, a life sentence. The verdict and the sentence brought a final, legal closure to a story that had begun with a lie. The man who had tried to hide his monstrous act behind a mask of grief was now stripped bare, his crime laid out for the world to see. Justice, slow and methodical, had prevailed. The case of Sabrina Benson is a heartbreaking and chilling reminder of the dark realities of domestic violence. It is a story of how a relationship that should have been a source of love and support became a catalyst for a murderous rage. It is also a powerful testament to the crucial role of forensic science in the pursuit of justice. Without the meticulous, scientific work of the pathologists at the Arkansas State Crime Lab, the truth of what happened in the house on Clover Drive might have remained buried forever. Another unsolved mystery, another life lost without explanation. Sabrina Benson was not the victim of a tragic, unexplained medical event. She was the victim of a man she loved and trusted, a man who, in a moment of rage, chose to end her life rather than walk away. Her story is a tragic one, but it is also a story that ends, not with a question mark, but with a period. The man who killed her is behind bars, his secret no longer held in the silence, but exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a courtroom. For Sabrina's family, the pain of their loss will never fade, but they can find a small measure of peace in the knowledge that the man who took her from them has been held accountable. His future now is bleak and empty as the one he created for the woman he was supposed to love. Story 3. In the summer of 2020, the city of Peterborough, a sprawling, modern town in the flat fenlands of Cambridgeshire, England, was like the rest of the world, adjusting to a new, unsettling rhythm of life. But in the home of the Walker family, a different, far more toxic kind of lockdown was in place. Here lived 17-year-old Bernadette Walker, a young woman known to her friends as B, who was standing on the fragile precipice between adolescence and adulthood. Bernadette was a student at Peterborough College, a talented photographer with a creative spirit that found its expression in the goth subculture she embraced. She dyed her hair in rainbow colors, a vibrant contrast to the often dark palette of her clothing. She was, by her friends' description, socially awkward. A shy, quiet girl whose friendships were often forged and maintained in the digital realms of social media. At the center of her world was the man she called Dad, Scott Walker. He was not her biological father, but he had been in her life for years, the partner of her mother, Sarah. To the outside world, they were a family. But behind the closed doors of their home, a terrible, corrosive secret was festering. A secret that had been eating away at the foundations of Bernadette's life for years. On Thursday, July 16, 2020, that secret finally, explosively came to the surface. In a moment of desperate courage, Bernadette confided in her mother. She told Sarah that Scott, the man she had been raised to trust, had been abusing her for years. It was a confession that should have been met with maternal protection, with outrage, with an immediate call to the police. Instead, it was met with a chilling, brutal denial. The horrifying exchange was chronicled in Bernadette's own handwriting. In a diary that was "Told my mum about my dad and the abuse," she wrote. Her words a testament to a betrayal so profound it is almost impossible to comprehend. She called me a liar and threatened to kill me if I told the police. What kind of parent wouldn't believe their daughter? In that moment, Bernadette's world collapsed. The two people who were supposed to be her protectors, her staunchest allies, had become her accusers, her threats. The home that should have been her sanctuary was now a prison of disbelief and menace. A decision was made, not for Bernadette's safety, but to let things calm down. The following evening, on Friday, July 17th, Scott Walker drove his stepdaughter to his parents' house, where she would spend the night, a temporary exile from the home that had become a war zone. As she left her own home, she had no way of knowing she would never return, that the man driving the car was not taking her to a place of temporary refuge, but was instead beginning the final, fatal act of a long and terrible tragedy. Saturday, July 18th, 2020, dawned as a typical summer day in Peterborough. Sometime between 10 o'clock and 11 a.m., Scott Walker arrived at his parents' house to pick up Bernadette. This was the last time she was ever seen alive by anyone other than her killer. What happened next is a story pieced together from the cold, hard data of cell phone records and the chilling logic of a prosecutorial theory. Scott Walker's phone, which was usually in constant, almost obsessive use, was switched off at 11:23 a.m. It remained off, a black hole of digital silence, for 91 minutes. It was switched back on at 12:54 p.m. It was during this hour and a half, the prosecution would later argue, in that silent, untrackable window of time, that Scott Walker murdered his stepdaughter. His motive was as simple as it was monstrous. He killed her to silence her, to prevent her from ever repeating the accusations of abuse that threatened to destroy his life. The first call Scott Walker made after his phone was turned back on was to his partner, Bernadette's mother, Sarah. The call lasted for more than 9 minutes. There was only one reason for a call of that length at that precise moment. Scott was telling Sarah that he had killed her daughter, and that he needed her help to cover it up. In that 9-minute phone call, an unholy alliance was forged, a pact between a killer and the mother of his victim, a conspiracy to hide a murder behind a web of lies. For 3 days, the silence from the Walker home was absolute. No call was made to the police. No frantic search was initiated. Then, in the early hours of Tuesday, July 21st, Sarah Walker reported her 17-year-old daughter missing. The story they told the police was the one Scott had concocted. Bernadette had run away. The deception that followed was elaborate and chillingly cruel. Sarah, the grieving mother, took control of Bernadette's phone and her social media accounts. She began sending messages to friends and family, messages designed to create the illusion that Bernadette was alive and well, that she had simply run away to escape the family drama. "I'm not coming home. Not till I'm 18 anyway," one message read. Another, sent to a close friend, claimed that her allegations of abuse against Scott were a lie. But the language of the messages was wrong, the phrasing stilted and unfamiliar to those who knew Bernadette well. Her friends were immediately suspicious. For weeks, Scott and Sarah played the part of worried parents. They pleaded for their daughter's safe return. Scott even posted a missing poster of Bernadette on his Facebook page, a grotesque act of public performance from a man who knew she was never coming home. The community, believing the story, rallied around them. Searches were organized. Flyers were distributed. But it was all a charade, a smokescreen designed to hide a terrible secret. While the community searched for a missing girl, her parents were searching for a way to get away with her murder. The police investigation, which began as a standard missing person case, was quickly complicated by the lies and misdirection of Scott and Sarah Walker. The messages supposedly from Bernadette created a confusing and contradictory trail, but the investigators of the Cambridgeshire Constabulary were methodical, and as they began to dig deeper, the Walker story started to unravel. A major breakthrough came when the police examined Scott Walker's cell phone data more closely. The data showed that on the morning Bernadette disappeared, his phone had not traveled along the route he claimed. Instead, it had pinged at a lock-up garage owned by his parents in the Walton area of Peterborough. The data also showed that he had made several more visits to this garage in the days and weeks following Bernadette's disappearance. The garage, a nondescript storage space, had become a place of intense interest. When investigators searched the garage, they found a rucksack belonging to Bernadette. And inside that rucksack, they found her diary. The discovery of the diary was the moment the case turned. In Bernadette's own words, the investigators found the story of the abuse, the confession to her mother, and her mother's shocking, threatening response. They now had a motive for murder that was as powerful as it was disturbing. Armed with this new evidence, the police brought Scott and Sarah Walker in for further questioning. Their stories, under the pressure of intense scrutiny, began to fall apart. On September 14, 2020, nearly 2 months after Bernadette was last seen, they were both arrested. The charge against Scott was murder. The charge against them both was perverting the course of justice. Even with no body, the police were convinced that Bernadette was dead, and that the two people who should have been most desperate to find her were, in fact, her killers and the architects of the cover-up. The search for a missing girl was over. The hunt for justice had just begun. The trial of Scott and Sarah Walker, which took place at Cambridge Crown Court in the summer of 2021, was a grim and emotional affair. With Bernadette's body still missing, the prosecution had to build its case on a foundation of circumstantial evidence. But that evidence, they argued, was overwhelming, and it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Scott Walker had murdered his stepdaughter to silence her, and her own mother had helped him cover it up. The prosecution, led by Lisa Wilding KC, laid out their case with a chilling precision. They presented the cell phone data that placed Scott at the lockup garage, not on the road where he claimed Bernadette had run away. They detailed the 91-minute window of silence, the period when they contended the murder had taken place. And they presented the jury with the most powerful evidence of all. The words from Bernadette's own diary, a heartbreaking account of a young girl betrayed by the two people she should have been able to trust most in the world. Friends of Bernadette testified about the suspicious messages they had received after her disappearance, messages that they knew instinctively had not been written by her. They spoke of a vibrant, creative young woman who, in the weeks before she vanished, had become withdrawn and fearful. Scott Walker's defense was built on a foundation of denial. He admitted to sending the fake messages, but he claimed it was at Sarah's behest, a desperate attempt to prevent social services from getting involved after Bernadette had run away. He maintained his story that she had simply gotten out of his car and vanished. He denied the allegations of abuse. And most chillingly, he refused to provide any information that might lead to the discovery of Bernadette's body. Sarah Walker's defense was even more complex. She admitted to her role in sending the fake messages and lying to the police, but she claimed she did so because she genuinely believed Bernadette was alive and had run away. Her defense attorney argued that there was no reason in logic, no reason in evidence, for her to believe that Scott had killed her daughter. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture of Sarah. They portrayed her as the guiding mind behind the cover-up, a woman who, faced with the horrifying reality of what her partner had done, had chosen to protect him rather than her own child. After a 6-week trial, the jury retired to deliberate. In July of 2021, they returned with their verdicts. Scott Walker was found guilty of the murder of Bernadette Walker. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of perverting the course of justice. Sarah Walker was found guilty of perverting the course of justice, knowing or believing her daughter to be dead. The sentencing, which took place in September 2021, was a moment of stark, legal condemnation. The judge, Mrs. Justice McGowan, sentenced Scott Walker to life in prison, with a minimum term of 32 years. In her sentencing remarks, she addressed his cruel refusal to reveal the location of Bernadette's body. "Cruelest of all," she said. "It's likely to mean some members of her family and friends will go on hoping she might be alive and might someday come back into their lives." His sentence was influenced by the newly enacted Helen's Law, which allows parole boards to consider a killer's refusal to disclose the location of their victims' remains when making release decisions. Sarah Walker was sentenced to 6 years in prison for her role in the cover-up. The story did not end there. In a final, hollow twist, on December 22, 2023, Scott Walker died in prison. He took the secret of where he had hidden Bernadette's body with him to the grave. The murder of Bernadette Walker is a story of almost unimaginable betrayal. It is the story of a young woman whose cry for help was met not with protection, but with a threat, and ultimately with a final, brutal silencing. It is a story of a mother who chose her abusive partner over her own child, a decision that led her to become an accomplice in the cover-up of her daughter's murder. And it is, most tragically, a story without a final chapter. The police have never found Bernadette's body. Her family has been denied the basic human decency of a funeral, a grave to visit, a place to mourn. The man who killed her is dead, but the ghost of his crime, and the ghost of the vibrant, talented young woman he murdered, will forever haunt the quiet landscape of Cambridgeshire, a chilling testament to the darkest depths of human depravity. Story 4. In the sprawling, sun-baked metropolis of Dallas, life moves with a relentless, hurried rhythm. But within the walls of the Art Institute of Dallas, a different tempo prevailed. Here, in the studios and classrooms, the air hummed with the quiet, intense energy of creation. It was a world of charcoal-smudged fingers, the scent of oil paint and turpentine, and the electric buzz of young minds alight with passion. In the fall of 2009, this was the world of Samantha Shelley Nance. At 20 years old, Shelley was a splash of vibrant color against the often muted canvas of the world. She had come to Dallas from the small, unassuming town of Italy, Texas, a place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. But Shelley's spirit was anything but slow or deliberate. She was a whirlwind of creative energy, a young woman who saw the world not just as it was, but as it could be, transformed by imagination and rendered in line and color. Her mother, Cynthia, would later recall the sudden, fierce seriousness with which Shelley pursued her calling. "I never knew how serious she was about what she wanted to do with her life," Cynthia would say, her voice a mixture of awe and sorrow. She was as serious as they come because she knew what she wanted to do and had her mind set on it. Shelley wasn't just attending art school, she was answering a vocation. She shared an off-campus apartment with another art student, Ashley Olvera. Their home was a typical student dwelling, a place of transition, filled with a mix of second-hand furniture, art supplies, and the easy camaraderie of two young women navigating the exhilarating, often confusing path to adulthood. Shelley's life in Dallas was a tapestry woven from threads of intense study, late-night creative sessions, and the budding excitement of a new romance. Her boyfriend was Nathan Schuck, a fellow student at the Art Institute. Theirs was a relationship that friends described as awkwardly adorable. Nathan was quiet, shy, and introverted, a stark contrast to Shelley's bright, outgoing personality. He was a young man who seemed more comfortable in the digital realms of video games like World of Warcraft than in the complex social landscapes of the real world. He had a fascination with Japanese culture, collecting knives and swords and even, at times, dressing up like a ninja. He was, by all accounts, an oddball, but to Shelley he was a gentle soul, a kindred spirit in a world that often felt too loud and too fast. Nathan, in turn, shared an apartment with another young man, Daniel William. At 26, Daniel was older than the typical college student. A former pastry chef in the Navy, he projected an air of worldliness that set him apart. He was gay, a fact that was of no consequence to his friendship with Nathan. The two were close, a pair of self-described geeks who bonded over their shared love of video games and a certain social awkwardness that left them on the periphery of the campus mainstream. Their friendship was a comfortable, established thing. But the introduction of Shelley Nance into that equation was about to become a catalyst for a chemical reaction so volatile, so toxic, that it would ultimately end in an explosion of unimaginable violence. A darkness was gathering on the edges of Shelley's bright, colorful world, an obsession that was curdling into a hatred so profound that it would soon demand a blood sacrifice. September 10th, 2009, was a Thursday. For Shelley, it was a day like any other, filled with classes, conversations, and the constant, simmering work of creation. In the evening, she spoke with her parents, Sam and Cynthia Nance, back in Italy. It was a routine call, the kind of check-in that bridges the distance between a child away at school and the family home she left behind. They talked about her classes, about her life, about the small, everyday details that make up a world. There was no hint of fear in her voice, no premonition of the horror that was about to unfold. The next day, Friday, September 11th, the phone at the Nance home rang. It was the Art Institute. Shelley hadn't shown up for her classes. A knot of unease tightened in Cynthia's stomach. That wasn't like Shelley. She was dedicated, responsible. She wouldn't just skip class. Cynthia and Sam tried calling their daughter's cell phone, again and again. Each unanswered call, each ring that echoed into the void, amplified their growing sense of dread. Their calls went to voicemail, her phone a silent, unresponsive brick. Frantic, they called the one person they knew could get to her, her roommate, Ashley Olvera. Ashley was away from the apartment, but she promised to go check on Shelley as soon as she could. The afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen when Ashley finally arrived at the apartment complex. She walked up the familiar steps, a sense of unease creeping over her. She turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door. The apartment was quiet, unnervingly still. She called out Shelley's name, but only silence answered. She walked through the small living room and down the short hallway to Shelley's bedroom. The door was closed. She pushed it open, and in that instant, the world stopped. The scene before her was a tableau from a nightmare, a vision of such brutal, bloody violence that it defied comprehension. Shelley was lying on her bed, her body drenched in blood, the sheets beneath her stained a deep, horrific crimson. The room was a canvas of slaughter. Ashley's mind recoiled, a scream catching in her throat. She stumbled back, fumbling for her phone, her fingers slick with a sudden, cold sweat. She dialed 911, her voice a choked, terrified whisper. The life of Samantha Shelley Nance, a life so full of color and promise, had been extinguished in a frenzy of blackest rage. The first responders to arrive at the apartment were met with a scene of almost unimaginable carnage. Detective Scott Sayers of the Dallas Police Department, a veteran of the homicide unit, stepped into Shelley's bedroom and was immediately struck by the sheer, unrestrained brutality of the attack. Shelley had been stabbed 42 times in her back and neck. The sheer number of wounds spoke of an attack that was not just meant to kill, but to annihilate. It was a deeply personal, frenzied assault that the coroner would later describe as overkill. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a robbery or a sexual assault. This was not the work of a stranger. This was the work of someone who knew Shelley, someone who had been welcomed into her home, and someone who was consumed by a murderous rage. The investigation began, as it always does, with those closest to the victim. The first and most obvious suspect was Shelley's quiet, quirky boyfriend, Nathan Shuck. Detectives brought him in for questioning, and the more they learned about him, the more suspicious he became. His strange ninja persona, his collection of swords and knives, it all painted a picture of a young man who might be capable of such violence. Friends told the police that the relationship between Shelley and Nathan had been on rocky ground, that she had been thinking about breaking up with him. Had he killed her in a fit of jealous rage when she tried to end things? It was a classic, tragically common motive. The detectives' suspicion intensified when they executed a search warrant on the apartment Nathan shared with Daniel William. In the common bathroom, they found what they believed was the smoking gun, a plastic bag containing a bloody tissue. The blood, they would later confirm, was Shelley's. It seemed like an open and shut case. The quiet, awkward art student with a fascination for blades had a dark side, a side that had lashed out and brutally murdered his girlfriend. The detectives were confident they had their man. But Nathan, under the intense pressure of the interrogation, had a different story to tell. He was adamant that he was innocent. And as he spoke, he began to paint a disturbing picture of his roommate, Daniel William. He told the detectives about Daniel's increasingly strange and possessive behavior, about a friendship that had soured and twisted into something dark and controlling. And then he pointed the finger directly at his roommate, suggesting that if there was blood in their apartment, it was Daniel who had put it there. It was a stunning accusation, one that could have been interpreted as a desperate attempt by a guilty man to deflect blame. But it was enough to make the detectives pause. They had focused so intently on the boyfriend that they had barely glanced at the roommate. It was time to take a closer look at Daniel William. As the detectives began to dig into Daniel William's life, the picture that emerged was one of a deeply troubled and dangerously obsessive young man. On the surface, he was just another student, a former Navy man trying to find his way. But beneath that placid exterior, a storm of resentment and jealousy was raging. The target of that storm was Shelley Nance. The investigators' new focus on Daniel quickly began to bear fruit. They pulled surveillance footage from a nearby Walmart from the morning of Thursday, September 10th, the day Shelley was murdered. And there he was. The grainy black and white video showed Daniel William moving through the aisles, his shopping cart filled with a strange collection of items: soap, hair dye, and most damningly, a box of blue nitrile gloves. Back at the crime scene, forensic technicians had painstakingly collected every shred of evidence. In the midst of the bloody chaos of Shelley's room, they had found something tiny, something that could easily have been missed. A small, torn piece of blue material recovered from Shelley's hand. It was consistent with the material of a nitrile glove. The Walmart footage provided a powerful, physical link between Daniel and the murder scene. The digital trail was just as incriminating. Detectives recovered text messages from Daniel's phone. On the day of the murder, he had been obsessively texting Shelley's roommate, Ashley, peppering her with questions about her whereabouts, trying to ascertain when she would be away from the apartment. He needed to know when Shelley would be alone. The texts abruptly stopped between 10:37 a.m. and 12:03 p.m., a window of time that corresponded precisely with the medical examiner's estimated time of death. He had confirmed his window of opportunity, and then he had gone silent. The motive, the detectives now believed, was a toxic, twisted form of jealousy. Daniel William was obsessively attached to his friend and roommate, Nathan Shuck. He viewed their friendship, their shared world of video games and social isolation, as the central relationship in his life. Shelley's presence had disrupted that. She had stolen Nathan from him. She had become the object of a festering, pathological hatred. This wasn't a love triangle in the traditional sense. It was a battle for possession. This theory was chillingly confirmed when investigators uncovered Daniel's journal. In its pages, he had poured out his resentment, his anger, his growing obsession with Shelley, and his hatred for the role she played in Nathan's life. His own words painted a portrait of a man spiraling into a dangerous, delusional state. A friend of Daniel's would later testify that Daniel had told him, in a moment of chilling clarity, "She's ruining everything." The investigators also learned that Daniel had a history of violent, uncontrollable outbursts. He had once been so enraged with his brother that he had taken a samurai sword and methodically destroyed his brother's room. While in the Navy, his behavior had been so erratic, his anger so explosive, that he had requested a transfer from his ship, admitting that he was afraid he might hurt one of his superior officers. This was not a man who had suddenly snapped. This was a man with a long simmering history of violence, a pressure cooker of rage just waiting for the right catalyst to explode. Shelley Nance had been that catalyst. With the Walmart footage, the text messages, the journal entries, and the piece of blue glove, the circumstantial case against Daniel William was becoming overwhelming. They could even explain how he had gotten into the apartment without force. Sometime before the murder, he had borrowed Ashley's car keys. Her apartment key was on the same keychain. The police theorized that he had made a copy, a key that would give him silent, easy access to his victim. On November 15, 2009, 2 months after the murder, police arrested Daniel William and charged him with the first-degree murder of Shelley Nance. The focus had shifted from the awkward boyfriend to the obsessive roommate. The true face of the monster had finally begun to emerge. In the fall of 2010, the trial of Daniel William began. The Dallas courtroom was packed, the public fascinated by the dark, twisted tale of jealousy and murder among a group of young art students. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Dewey Mitchell, laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented the jury with the mountain of circumstantial evidence they had so carefully compiled. They played the Walmart surveillance video, a silent film that told a story of premeditated murder. They showed the jury the text messages, a digital chronicle of Daniel's obsessive need to isolate his victim. They presented the evidence of the blue glove fragment, a tiny thread connecting him directly to the violent struggle in Shelley's room. Nathan Shuck took the stand, a reluctant and tragic figure at the center of this deadly drama. He testified about Daniel's increasingly possessive behavior, about his open hostility towards Shelley, a hostility that had grown from muttered comments into a palpable, menacing hatred. His testimony painted a clear picture of the toxic dynamic that had taken root in their small apartment. The most emotional testimony came from Shelley's mother, Cynthia Nance. She took the stand, her voice heavy with a grief that was still as raw as it was on the day she received the news. She spoke of her daughter, of her light, her talent, her boundless future. She told the court and the world about the devastating, permanent hole that Shelley's murder had torn in the fabric of their family. "No parent should have to bury their child," she said, her words echoing in the silent courtroom. "It's rough to have to put her in the ground at such a young age. It tears at my heart every day. It hurts that she's gone, and it's still as bad as it was the first day." Daniel Williams' defense team argued that the case was purely circumstantial, that odd behavior and a troubled past did not make their client a murderer. Daniel himself maintained his innocence, at one point even fabricating a story about being attacked by a black man at knife point on his way to Shelley's apartment, a desperate, baseless lie that was quickly dismantled by the lack of any supporting evidence. After weeks of testimony, the jury retreated to deliberate. The weight of the evidence, though circumstantial, was undeniable. In November 2011, they returned with a verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Daniel William, his face a stony, emotionless mask, was led away. He was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving 30 years. After the sentencing, when asked why he had done it, his answer was simple, direct, and utterly devoid of remorse. It was a 3-word confession that laid bare the cold, black heart of his crime. "Because I hated her," he said. For Shelley's family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could not bring peace. The loss was too profound, the violence too senseless. Her father, Sam, spoke of a numbness that had settled over him, a deep, emotional frost that prevented him from even crying when their family dog died. "I just dug a hole and buried him," he said, his words a testament to the hollowing out effect of grief. Cynthia Nance, in a victim impact statement, spoke directly to the man who had destroyed her family. "I hope you enjoy your time in jail," she told him, "and I hope you develop a conscience while you're there." The murder of Shelley Nance was a tragedy born of a sick, obsessive jealousy. But in the years since her death, those who loved her have worked tirelessly to ensure that her legacy is one of creativity and light, not of darkness and violence. The Art Institute of Dallas established the Shelley Nance Memorial Scholarship, a fund to help other aspiring young artists pursue their dreams, to give them the chance that was stolen from Shelley. Her hometown of Italy, Texas, holds annual art events in her name, a celebration of the passion that defined her life. Through these acts of remembrance, Shelley's spirit endures. The vibrant colors of her life, her art, and her dreams were not erased by the act of a single, hate-filled man. They live on, a permanent and beautiful masterpiece painted on the hearts of all who knew and loved her. The art of murder may have ended her life, but the art of her life continues to inspire. Story 5. The quiet, tree-lined streets of Springfield, Virginia, in the autumn of 1994 were the very picture of suburban tranquility. It was a world of neatly kept lawns, family homes, and the gentle, predictable rhythms of middle-class life. On a peaceful cul-de-sac, in a modest house with a back deck overlooking a stand of trees, lived Robin Ware Lawrence. At 37, Robin was a woman whose life was a vibrant canvas of her own making. She was a gifted artist, a graduate of Carnegie Mellon University, whose talent was so remarkable that she had been chosen to sculpt the first medal for the Martin Luther King Jr. Nonviolent Peace Prize, an honor that was eventually bestowed upon the legendary Rosa Parks. For her parents, who had grown up under the oppressive shadow of Jim Crow in Memphis, Tennessee, it was a moment of immense pride, a symbol of how far the world and their daughter had come. But Robin's art was not her only passion. She was a wife to Ollie Lawrence, an airline executive, and a devoted mother to their 2-year-old daughter, Nicole. Nicole was their miracle child. Born with a life-threatening liver condition, she had undergone a transplant and required a daily regimen of immunosuppressive medications to survive. Her fragility made her all the more precious, and Robin's world revolved around her care and her boundless love for her family. Their house was a home filled with promise, a place where they were putting down roots, working on home improvements and dreaming of the future. In November 1994, that future was just beginning to unfold. Ollie was away on a business trip in the Bahamas, a routine part of his job. Robin and Nicole were at home, a mother and daughter settled into the quiet comfort of their familiar world. On Friday, November 18th, the day began like any other. The last time anyone heard from Robin was around 6 p.m. that evening. A comfortable silence then fell over the house on the cul-de-sac. The weekend arrived. In the Bahamas, Ollie tried to call home, but the phone just rang and rang unanswered. A knot of unease began to tighten in his stomach. It wasn't like Robin not to answer. As Saturday bled into Sunday, his unease grew into a gnawing worry. He called Lori Lindbergh, Robin's close friend, and asked her to go over to the house and check on them. On Sunday, November 20th, Lori drove to her friend's house, a sense of foreboding shadowing her steps. The house was unnervingly quiet. She knocked, but there was no answer. She tried the doors, but they were locked. Walking around to the back of the house, she noticed that a window leading from the deck was slightly ajar. A cold dread washed over her. Hoisting herself up, she slipped through the window and into the silent house. The scene that greeted her was one of quiet domesticity, but something was terribly wrong. And then she saw little Nicole, wandering alone through the house, a tiny, solitary figure in the unnerving stillness. Alarmed, Lori moved deeper into the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She pushed open the door to the master bedroom, and the world tilted on its axis. Blood was smeared on the walls, and on the floor, amidst a scene of unimaginable violence, lay the body of her beautiful, vibrant friend. The phone cord had been cut. In that instant, Lori's mind snapped into a state of triage. Her first thought was for Nicole. The little girl was alive, but she was medically fragile. How long had she been alone? Had she taken her life-saving medication? Lori scooped up the child, rushed her out of that house of horrors, and drove her straight to the hospital, her mind reeling from the shock of what she had just seen. Only then did she make the call that would bring the world crashing down. She called 911. Her next call was even harder. She had to tell Robin's parents. Robin's father, Robert Ware Sr., a World War II veteran, answered the phone. Lori's words were blunt, stripped of any preamble by the sheer force of the horror. "Robin is dead," she said. On the other end of the line, she could hear Robin's mother, Jessie, begin to wail, a sound she would later describe as a primal anguish, a sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In that moment, a family was shattered. An idyllic suburban street was transformed into a major crime scene. And a question as cold and sharp as a shard of glass lodged itself in the heart of everyone who knew and loved Robin Ware Lawrence. Who could have done this, and why? They could not possibly imagine that the answer would lie buried in silence for nearly 30 years, held by a man who was, by his own chilling definition, the boogeyman. The first officer to step into the nightmare at Robin Lawrence's home was Detective Mark Garman of the Fairfax County Police. The scene that confronted him in the master bedroom was one of savage, intimate violence. Robin had been stabbed 49 times. The sheer number of defensive wounds on her hands and arms spoke of a desperate, ferocious fight for her life. She had been assaulted in her bed and had fought her way out, struggling against her attacker until she was finally overcome. The violence was personal, frenzied, and utterly devastating. As crime scene investigators began the methodical, grim task of processing the scene, a heartbreaking narrative of the preceding 48 hours began to emerge. Scattered around Robin's body and throughout the house were bloody tissues. Detective Garman, a father himself, immediately understood their terrible significance. He believed that 2-year-old Nicole, seeing her mother bleeding, had done what any child would do. She had tried to help. She had tried to put tissues on her mother's wounds, to make it better, to stop the bleeding, an act of innocent love in the face of incomprehensible horror. Even more poignantly, several empty baby bottles were found near Robin's body. Investigators theorized that as the hours passed and hunger set in, Nicole, in her toddler logic, had brought her empty bottles to her mother, trying to wake her, trying to tell her she was hungry. For 2 days, she had been a lone survivor in a silent house with her mother's body, a tiny ghost in a landscape of grief. The investigation began, as it so often does, with those closest to the victim. Robin's husband, Ollie, was now not only a grieving widower, but also a potential suspect. The timing of the murder, while he was conveniently out of the country, was immediately suspicious. Detectives dug into the couple's life, and it didn't take long for them to uncover a secret. Ollie was having an affair with a colleague. This discovery cast a dark shadow of motive over the case. Robin's family, reeling from their loss, was stunned by the revelation, but never believed Ollie was capable of such a monstrous act. "He's not that type of person," her brother, Robert Ware Jr., would later say. Detectives from Fairfax County flew to the Bahamas to verify Ollie's alibi. They confirmed he had been on the flight he claimed, and had been at the hotel he was supposed to be at. They interviewed his lover. They found no evidence to connect either of them to the murder. With Ollie cleared, the investigation was adrift. There was no sign of forced entry, aside from the window Lori Lindbergh had used. Nothing of value had been stolen. Cash and jewelry were left untouched in the bedroom. The motive was not robbery. It was something far darker, far more personal. Or so it seemed. The family was tormented by the randomness of it all. "I remember thinking at the funeral, Robin's killer could be in this room with us," her sister, Mary Ware Callens, recalled. The thought that someone they knew, someone who might be offering them condolences, could be responsible was a terrifying one. But the police had no leads. The killer had left no fingerprints. The case was a blank wall. But he had not been perfect. In the bathroom, while documenting the scene, Detective Garman noticed something small, something that could easily have been overlooked. On the towel rod of the sliding tub door, there was a washcloth, and on that washcloth was a small brownish stain. That stain was tested. It was blood. DNA was extracted from it, and it did not belong to Robin. It also did not match Ollie or his lover. Investigators believed it belonged to the killer, who must have injured himself during the violent struggle. This single, tiny drop of biological material was the only tangible link to the man who had destroyed a family. The DNA profile was created and uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's national database. The investigators waited for a hit. None came. The profile matched no one in the system. The weeks turned into months, the months into years. The case grew cold. The files were shelved, the evidence stored away. For the Lawrence and War families, life became a new, fractured reality. They had to learn to live with the not knowing, with the fear that a monster was walking free. "I actually felt afraid at home in my bed," Mary Warcowan said. "Thinking about someone just from out of the blue could show up from anywhere and kill you in your house. That's just a scary thought that you're not safe anywhere." Robin's father went to his wife's grave, never knowing who had killed their daughter. Mary eventually resigned herself to the idea that the case might never be solved. She had to let it go. But the DNA on the washcloth, stored in an evidence locker, did not let go. It waited, a silent witness holding a secret that would, decades later, finally be forced into the light. In April 2021, nearly 27 years after the murder, the cold case file of Robin, where Lawrence landed on the desks of detectives Melissa Wallace and John Long of the Fairfax County Police Department. They were part of a new generation of investigators, armed with tools that were the stuff of science fiction in 1994. As they reviewed the case, they were struck by the sheer brutality of the crime and the profound tragedy of the little girl left behind. They were determined to give it one more push. The first avenue they explored was the burgeoning field of genetic genealogy. They sent the killer's DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in using public genealogy databases to track down suspects. The process involves finding distant relatives of the unknown person and then meticulously building out family trees to pinpoint a potential person of interest. But the news from Parabon was discouraging. The DNA matches in the databases were incredibly distant, fourth to sixth cousins. The shared ancestors were so far back in time that the number of descendants was enormous. Parabon gave the case a solvability rate of 0. They essentially told the detectives that it was an impossible task. But the Fairfax County Police had a secret weapon, a volunteer genealogist named Liz. Liz, who asked that her last name not be used, was an amateur with a passion for solving puzzles and a desire to give back to her community. Undaunted by Parabon's assessment, she took on the case in her spare time for free. For 3.5 years, she sat at her computer, patiently untangling the complex, interwoven threads of 1,500 distant cousins. It was a monumental, often frustrating task. "I was ready to give up a number of times," she later admitted. "But I kept thinking, well, I'll just finish this or just do this one more thing." Her big break came when she traced some of the suspect's ancestors to Canada. She found 2 cousins who were not related to each other, meaning the killer had to be a descendant of the point where their family trees intersected through marriage. Painstakingly, she built the trees backward and then forward again until she found the link. A woman on one tree had married a man on the other. The killer had to be a descendant of that couple. Following that line down through the generations, she landed on a name, Stephen Smirk. When Liz sent the name to Detective Wallace, the reaction was skeptical. Wallace looked into Stephen Smirk's background and found nothing. He was a computer programmer living in the suburbs of Niskayuna, New York. He was married to a defense attorney, had 2 kids in high school, and lived in a nice house. He didn't have so much as a speeding ticket on his record. "I'm thinking, there's no way this is our guy," Wallace recalled. But then they found his high school yearbook photo. At age 16, Stephen Smirk bore a striking resemblance to a DNA phenotyping sketch that Parabon had also created, a composite image of what the killer might look like based on predictions from his DNA. Suddenly, it seemed possible. Smirk had lived in Virginia in 1994. He was the right age. The pieces fit. In September 2023, Detectives Wallace and Long drove to Niskayuna. Their plan was simple: knock on his door and ask for a DNA sample to confirm or deny the genealogical link. They had no idea what to expect. They found Smirk at home alone. "All we said is we are detectives from Fairfax County, Virginia, and we're looking into a cold case from the 90s, Wallace said. Smirk's reaction was no reaction. He was stone-faced. No surprise, no fear, nothing. He invited them in. They explained they were investigating a murder and that his DNA might help them. He didn't ask who was killed. He didn't ask why they were there. He just calmly consented to give them a DNA swab. The entire interaction took 5 minutes. The detectives left, bewildered by his unnerving calm, and checked into their hotel to wait for the DNA results. But they didn't have to wait long. A few hours later, Detective Wallace's phone rang. It was Stefan Smirk. What he said next sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. "I'm at the police department to turn myself in," he said. Wallace was stunned. "Turn yourself in for what?" she asked. His reply was calm, matter-of-fact. "I'm here to turn myself in for the murder." In a recorded 911 call he made moments later, after having trouble getting into the locked police station, his reasoning was chillingly simple. They collected DNA, so it's only a matter of time. The boogeyman, who had lived in plain sight as a suburban husband and father for nearly 30 years, was finally ready to talk. In a small interrogation room in Niskayuna, New York, Stefan Smirk sat across from the two detectives who had just upended his life. He was calm, nonchalant, as if he were discussing the weather. Without much prompting, he began to confess to the murder of Robin or Lawrence. In November 1994, he told them he was a 22-year-old soldier stationed at Fort Myer in Arlington, Virginia. On the night of the murder, he had been drinking beer and taking ephedrine pills, a stimulant. And then an idea took hold of him, an urge he could not control. "Something inside me said that I knew that I was going to kill somebody. I did not know who I was going to kill," he told the detectives in his recorded confession. "It was like this overbearing thought in my brain that I just had to kill somebody." He said he chose Robin's neighborhood because he was familiar with it. Friends had once stayed in a house nearby. He had no idea who lived at Robin's address. It was completely random. There could have been 50 people in that house. I don't know. They could have all had guns and shot me dead. I wasn't even thinking about that, he said. All he was thinking about was killing. He confirmed he entered through the back deck, wearing a ski mask and leather gloves. He went down the hall and into the master bedroom. "I startled her. She got out of bed," he recounted. "She was on her knees. She was just begging for her life. I cut her up pretty good. I did everything they taught me in the military, hand-to-hand combat." He told the investigators he was highly influenced by demons and had joined the military because he wanted to kill people. Then he made a statement that was both shocking and, in the minds of the detectives, profoundly perplexing. "I want to tell you right now that she's the only person that I've killed. I'm married, I have kids, but I honestly believe that if it wasn't for my wife and my kids, I probably would be a serial killer," he said. "I am a serial killer who's only killed once." As the interview continued, he provided the detail that would definitively tie him to the crime scene. Detective Wallace asked him if he had been injured that night. He said that Robin had clawed at his face, leaving a small scar. Wallace then asked if he had gone into the bathroom. "I don't remember that," Smirk replied. "If I did go into the bathroom, it would have been to look at what she did in my face." That was the confirmation Wallace needed. It explained why his DNA was on the washcloth. The circle was closed. When asked if he had anything to say to Robin's family, his response was devoid of any human emotion. How do I say this? I know you're recording. I don't feel anything for the family. I can't say that any other way. I feel bad that I did it, because I knew someday my personal freedom would be affected." It wasn't remorse for the life he had taken, but regret for the consequences to himself. Detective Wallace believed his confession was not an act of conscience, but one of control. He knew the DNA would convict him, and he chose to turn himself in on his own terms. A week later, forensic testing confirmed that the DNA from the washcloth was a match to Stefan Smirk. The odds of it being anyone else were more than 1 in 7 trillion. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Robin Lawrence. The news sent a shockwave through the Warr and Lawrence families. After 29 years of living in the dark, they finally had a name and a face. "How is it that he could live his life with his family when he blew up our family 30 years ago?" Mary Warcowens asked. "Where is the justice in that?" The family wanted a trial. They wanted the world to see the man who had done this and to hear the full story of what he had taken from them. But the legal system often moves in ways that prioritize certainty over spectacle. Prosecutors, facing the challenge of a 30-year-old case with some witnesses having passed away and memories having faded, offered Smirk a plea deal. In October 2024, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for a recommended sentence, avoiding a trial. The family was disappointed, but they understood. The deal guaranteed accountability. On March 7, 2025, Stefan Smirk, now 53 years old, appeared in court for his sentencing. His attorney argued for a more lenient sentence, painting a picture of a troubled young man who had struggled with alcohol, substance abuse, and an undiagnosed bipolar II disorder in the early 90s. But the judge, faced with the senseless, random brutality of the crime, sentenced him to 70 years in prison. Stefan Smirk will be eligible for parole in 2037, when he is 65 years old. For Robin's family, the sentence brought a measure of closure, as long as he never walks free again. Her daughter Nicole, the 2-year-old who survived 2 days alone in that house of horror, stood strong by her family's side at the courthouse, a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Robin Ware Lawrence is not here to see her daughter grow up, to create more of her powerful art, or to share her light with the world. That was all stolen from her on a cold November night by a man who wanted to kill somebody. But her spirit lives on in the art that hangs on her family's walls, in the memories of those who loved her, and in the daughter who survived. The boogeyman who haunted their lives for 3 decades is now behind bars, his ordinary suburban life revealed as a grotesque mask. Justice, after a long and painful journey, has finally been served. But for the family, the knowledge of what he did, and how Robin suffered, is a wound that will never fully heal. Her light was extinguished, but the memory of it, like her art, remains vibrant, powerful, and unforgettable. Story 6. The city of Charlottesville, Virginia, is a place of gentle, rolling hills and deep historical roots. A town where the past feels ever-present in the stately brick of the university and the quiet dignity of its tree-lined residential streets. Rugby Avenue is one such street, a peaceful enclave of well-tended homes and established families. In 2014, the house at number 1627 was more than just a structure of wood and brick. It was a testament to a unique and profound love story. It was the home of Robin and Monty Aldridge. Robin Aldridge, at 58, was a woman woven into the very fabric of her community. For 3 decades, she had been a special education teacher in the Albemarle County school system, a career that spoke of a deep well of patience, compassion, and unwavering dedication. She was a beloved figure, a woman who had devoted her life to helping children navigate the world's complexities. In the year 2000, that devotion took on its most personal and profound form. Robin, then a single woman, traveled halfway across the world to a small orphanage in Ukraine and adopted a little girl. She named her Monty. Their life together, as their obituary would later state, was a true love story. They had come together from worlds away, a mother and daughter who chose each other, forging a bond that was as fierce as it was tender. Their home on Rugby Avenue became a haven, a place friends and family would remember as being filled with music, art, food, animals, children, and love. By the time she was 17, Monty was a vibrant junior at Charlottesville High School, a regular at the local music resource center, and a young woman standing on the cusp of her own life. A life made possible by the love of the woman who had crossed an ocean to find her. But in the fall of 2014, a shadow had begun to fall across this idyllic world, a darkness that was creeping in through the invisible wires and glowing screens of the internet. Monty had struck up an online acquaintance with a man named Gene Everett Washington. At 30, Washington was a man from a different world. He was married with a wife, Katie, and a young child of his own. He lived in the Barracks West apartment complex, a few miles and a world away from the quiet comfort of Rugby Avenue. And he had a long, troubled history with the law, a rap sheet that included convictions for grand larceny, breaking and entering, drug charges, and assault. He was a man on probation, a man whose life was a chaotic landscape of instability and poor choices. The exact nature of the relationship between the 17-year-old high school student and the 30-year-old ex-convict was murky, hidden in the private spaces of text messages and online chats. The police would later confirm that they were known to each other, their last known contact having been in late October. Washington's wife, Katie, believed their relationship was sexual. To her friends, Monty never mentioned Gene Washington. He was a secret, a hidden corner of her life. He was a danger she could not possibly have comprehended, a predator who was circling, waiting for an opportunity. In the first week of December, that opportunity would arrive, and the love story of the house on Rugby Avenue would come to a brutal, fiery end. Friday, December 5th, 2014, was a cold, dark night in Charlottesville. Just before the stroke of midnight, a flicker of orange against the black sky caught the eye of a neighbor on Rugby Avenue. The house at 1627, the home of Robin and Monty Aldridge, was on fire. A frantic call was made to 911, and within minutes, the quiet street was filled with the wail of sirens and the urgent shouts of firefighters. Crews battled the intense flames, which were concentrated on the home's lower level. Once they had beaten back the fire enough to enter the smoke-filled house, they made a horrifying discovery. Inside, they found the bodies of Robin and Monty Aldridge, but it was immediately clear that the fire had not killed them. The scene was one of shocking, savage violence. Both mother and daughter had suffered obvious, massive blunt force trauma. They had been brutally beaten to death before the killer, in a final, desperate act of concealment, had swaddled their bodies in blankets and set their home ablaze. The scene was so gruesome, so profoundly violent, that it shook even the most seasoned investigators. "It was the worst I've ever seen in 21 years, Charlottesville Police Detective Sergeant Jim Mooney would later state. The quiet house of love had been transformed into a charnel house. As the first pale light of dawn broke over the blackened, water-soaked shell of the home, a massive investigation was launched. The police were not just looking for an arsonist, they were hunting a monster. In the first critical hours of the investigation, the detectives began to piece together a timeline of terror. They quickly discovered that several things were missing from the home: a television and both Robin's and Monty's cell phones. Most significantly, Robin's car, a blue 2003 Toyota Matrix, was gone from the driveway. The stolen car and the pings from Robin's phone gave the investigators their first crucial lead. The trail led them away from the quiet, leafy neighborhood of Rugby Avenue and towards the sprawling Barracks West apartment complex a few miles away. There, in the parking lot, they found the abandoned Toyota Matrix. In a nearby dumpster, the search uncovered a treasure trove of evidence. They found Robin's phone and other items that had been discarded, including a distinctive pair of black, white, and orange high-top basketball sneakers. The investigators immediately began canvassing the apartment complex, showing photos of the victims, asking if anyone had seen the car or the man who had driven it there. It didn't take long for a name to surface: Gene Everett Washington. He lived there, and a source would later confirm he owned the exact same pair of sneakers that had been found in the dumpster. The net began to tighten. Surveillance footage from the complex showed a man matching Washington's description carrying the shoes toward the dumpster. The police discovered that Washington was on probation, and a check of his record revealed a long and violent criminal history. They had their prime suspect. On December 8th, just 3 days after the murders, Gene Washington was arrested, initially on a probation violation. At the time of his arrest, he had Monty's phone in his possession. A subsequent search of his apartment turned up the final missing piece of the puzzle: the television that had been stolen from the Aldridge home. The physical evidence was overwhelming, a chain of damning links that stretched from the dumpster at his apartment complex all the way back to the smoldering ruins of the house on Rugby Avenue. Faced with this mountain of evidence, Washington at first denied everything. But as the days in custody turned into weeks, his story began to change. He began to talk, to write letters, to spin a series of bizarre and self-serving narratives, each one more incredible than the last. The police had their man, but the question of why remained a tangled, horrifying mystery. Was this a robbery gone wrong? Or was it something far more personal, a crime born of a twisted, obsessive relationship that had ended in a bloodbath? The search for the truth would lead investigators into the dark, labyrinthine mind of a killer. In the months and years following his arrest, Gene Washington, from the confines of his jail cell, began a prolific and bizarre letter-writing campaign. He sent missives to news outlets, to the Charlottesville police chief, to the Attorney General's office, to the vice mayor, to anyone he thought might listen. In these letters, he spun a series of wild, contradictory, and deeply disturbing tales, each one designed to absolve himself of guilt and cast himself as a victim. In one version of his story, he claimed to be a womanizer who was involved with both Robin and Monty Aldridge. He described a love triangle, claiming that both mother and daughter were obsessed with him. In a letter to the Attorney General's office, postmarked just over a year after the murders, he laid out a scenario of pure fiction. He claimed that on the night of December 5th, he was having consensual with Monty when Robin came home, found them, and flew into a rage, attacking them both. "I was under imminent danger and using self-defense," he wrote, claiming that he and Monty had fought back, and that in the ensuing chaos, both women were killed. To a clinical and forensic psychologist, Dr. Jeffrey Aaron, who spent some 18 hours evaluating him, he told a slightly different, but equally incredible, version of the same story. In this telling, an enraged Robin had attacked him and Monty with a hammer and a knife. He and Monty had allegedly run upstairs and locked themselves in her room. He claimed he tried to leave, but Robin, still angry, threatened to call the police. It was then, he said, that he became scared and started swinging, killing them both in a fit of panicked self-preservation. His defense team, led by Capitol Defender Jennifer Stanton, clung to this narrative. They argued that this was not a premeditated crime, but a tragic and explosive outcome of a deeply dysfunctional relationship. This was not a crime between strangers, Stanton would argue in court. Jean went to see Monty for one reason only, and that was to continue with their relationship. They painted a picture of Washington as a man with significant intellectual disabilities. His IQ was tested at 76, a man who had endured a traumatic, abusive childhood and who, in a moment of high emotion and fear, had simply snapped. But the prosecution, led by Libby Colleen, saw a very different truth. They saw a cold, calculating, and brutal killer. Their theory of the crime was simple and chilling. This was a robbery that had turned into a double murder. They believed that Jean Washington had gone to the Aldridge home with the intent to steal. Monty, they theorized, had walked in on him during the robbery, and he had killed her to silence her. Then, with a chilling patience, he had waited for Robin to return home, and he had killed her too. The prosecution methodically dismantled Washington's stories, pointing out the glaring inconsistencies. A voicemail message confirmed that Robin and Monty had not arrived at the house at the same time, a fact that supported the prosecution's theory that the killer had waited for his second victim. Despite Washington's claims of a violent struggle, he had no defensive wounds, none of the marks one would expect on a person who had fought off an attack from two people, one of whom was supposedly armed with a hammer and a knife. And there was another damning piece of evidence. Washington had told a friend weeks before the murders that he would be selling a car, a statement that suggested a premeditated plan to steal Robin's Toyota Matrix. The two narratives stood in stark, irreconcilable opposition, one of a love triangle gone horribly wrong, the other of a cold-blooded robbery and murder. Faced with the overwhelming physical evidence against him, and the prospect of a capital murder trial where he could face the death penalty, Jean Washington made a choice. In June 2017, he entered an Alford plea to capital and second-degree murder. It was a legal maneuver that allowed him to maintain his innocence while acknowledging that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict him beyond a reasonable doubt. On September 25, 2017, the final chapter of the legal saga played out in a crowded Charlottesville courtroom. The room was filled with friends and family of the victims, their faces a portrait of grief that 3 years had not diminished. Washington's grandmother, Catherine Burton, also took the stand, speaking of her grandson's own pain at having lost his brother to murder years before. In a moment of profound grace, outside the courtroom, the friends and family of Robin and Monty Aldridge hugged her, a recognition of a shared, though vastly different, landscape of loss. The judge, weighing the brutality of the crime against the mitigating factors of Washington's troubled life and intellectual disabilities, handed down the sentence. Jean Washington was sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 40 years. In the end, there were no real victors. Their lives were cut short with these brutal murders, and their survivors have to go through that loss, prosecutor Libby Colleen said after the sentencing. The love story that had begun in a Ukrainian orphanage and blossomed in a quiet house on Rugby Avenue had been erased by a senseless act of violence. Robin Aldridge's 3 decades of service to her community, Monty's bright, burgeoning future, it was all extinguished in a single night of fire and blood. The house at 1627, Rugby Avenue, no longer stands, but the memory of the 2 women who filled it with love endures, a heartbreaking reminder of all that was lost. Story 7. The wind that sweeps across the east coast of Tasmania carries with it the taste of salt and the scent of eucalyptus, a wild, clean perfume that speaks of ancient forests and the vast, cold expanse of the Tasman Sea. It is a land of dramatic beauty, where rugged coastlines give way to serene beaches of white sand, and the water, a dazzling tapestry of turquoise and sapphire, crashes against granite rocks splattered with orange lichen. In the spring of 1995, this landscape was a picture of profound peace, a remote corner of the world that felt a million miles away from the troubles of a distant Europe. It was this promise of tranquility, of an untouched paradise, that had called to Victoria Cafasso. At 20 years old, Victoria was a young woman standing on the precipice of her life. Born in England to an Italian family, she was a blend of cultures, fluent in English, Italian, and French, her mind as open and expansive as the world she longed to explore. Her father was a lawyer in Italy, her mother owned a travel agency, and Victoria, following in her father's footsteps, was a law student. But she was also a dreamer. The rigid corridors of academia felt confining, and a restlessness had taken root in her heart. She decided to defer her studies for a year, to trade law books for a backpack and courtrooms for the open road. It was a choice born of youthful yearning, a desire to see the world before settling into the serious business of life. Her journey began in England, a visit to her grandmother, a reconnection with her British roots. From there, her sights were set on the most distant point she could imagine, Tasmania. The decision was not entirely random. Her cousin, whom she had only met twice in her life, lived there, in a small coastal town called Beaumaris. It was a tenuous connection, a single friendly face in a land she had only seen in photographs, but it was enough. It was an anchor in the unknown. On October 6, 1995, after a long series of flights that stitched continents together, Victoria's plane descended towards Launceston, Tasmania. As she looked out the window, she saw a rolling green landscape, a patchwork of farms and forests that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. This was it. The adventure had begun. Her cousin was there to meet her, a warm and welcoming presence. On the drive to Beaumaris, they stopped at Shelley's Lookout, a vantage point that offered a breathtaking panorama of the coast. Below them, Beaumaris Beach stretched out like a pale ribbon, the waves gently lapping at the shore. Victoria breathed in the clean, crisp air, a smile playing on her lips. She had found her paradise. The next few days were a gentle immersion into this new, slower way of life. She stayed with her cousin, the days passing in a quiet rhythm of short walks and easy conversation. The world of Ospedaletti, with its bustling Italian streets, felt a world away. Here, the loudest sounds were the cry of the gulls and the whisper of the wind through the coastal scrub. She was a visitor, an observer, taking in the raw, untamed beauty of the place. She was safe. She was happy. She had no way of knowing that the serene beauty of Beaumaris Beach was a deceptive facade, and that in the heart of this tranquil paradise, a monstrous darkness was waiting. Wednesday, October 11th, 1995, dawned bright and clear, one of those perfect spring days that feels full of promise. The sun climbed high in a cloudless sky, its warmth chasing away the morning chill. For Victoria, it was a day for the beach. Sometime after 9 a.m., she left her cousin's house for a walk, her path leading her, as it so often did, towards the sea. She was last seen alive around 10 a.m., a solitary figure on the vast expanse of Beaumaris Beach, sunbathing near a small outlet known as Freshwater Creek. The beach that morning was not deserted, but it was far from crowded. This was not a tourist hotspot packed with umbrellas and beach towels. It was a locals' beach, a place where people came to walk their dogs, to fish, to find a moment of solitude. Police would later estimate that as many as 50 people may have come and go from that stretch of sand between mid-morning and early afternoon. Fishermen cast their lines into the surf, locals strolled along the waterline, and cars passed on the nearby road. Life went on in its ordinary, unassuming way. Yet, In the midst of this mundane activity, something terrible was unfolding in plain sight, yet unseen by all. No one heard a scream. No one saw a struggle. The gentle rhythm of the waves and the vastness of the open space seemed to swallow the violence whole. The attack, when it came, was sudden and savage. The state coroner would later piece together the horrific sequence of events. The killer first attacked Victoria with a blunt object, a blow of such force that it broke 3 of her teeth. She had tried to defend herself, to fight back against this sudden, inexplicable explosion of violence. But her defense was quickly overwhelmed. The blunt force attack was followed by a frenzy of stabbing. 17 times the blade of a knife pierced her body, a brutal, merciless assault that left no chance for survival. The official time of death was estimated to be a narrow window, sometime between 11:30 a.m. and 12:35 p.m. In the bright, unforgiving light of midday, on a public beach, Victoria Cafasso's life was brutally extinguished. It wasn't until 1:30 p.m. that her body was found. A local resident, walking along the beach, made the grim discovery. Victoria was lying partially in the water at the edge of Freshwater Creek, her body a testament to the horror that had taken place. The scene was chaotic. She was partly undressed, a detail the police believed was likely the result of the violent struggle, not a sexual assault. The signs of that struggle were found 50 meters away, further up the beach, her belongings scattered in the sand, marking the spot where the attack had begun. It was as if a whirlwind of violence had torn through this peaceful place, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The discovery sent a shockwave through the small, tight-knit community of Beaumaris. The police were called, and the tranquil beach was transformed into a crime scene. But from the very beginning, the investigation was plagued by problems. In the initial confusion and horror, the scene was not properly secured. People, including the first officers to arrive, walked through the area, potentially contaminating or destroying vital evidence. The coroner would later criticize the fact that forensic investigators were not called to the scene immediately. Victoria's body was moved and covered with a tarpaulin that had not been at the scene, another potential breach of protocol. Critical photographs and videos of the scene, as it was first discovered, were not taken. In the crucial first hours of the investigation, a series of mistakes were made that would haunt the case for decades to come. As the sun began to set on that terrible day, casting long shadows across the sand, the full weight of the tragedy began to settle. A young woman, a visitor who had come to this place seeking beauty and peace, had found only violence and death. Her family in Italy, who had waved her off on her great adventure, were about to receive the most devastating news imaginable. And for the people of Beaumaris, the beach they had always known as a place of solace and recreation would forever be marked by the memory of what had happened there. A killer had walked among them, committed an act of unspeakable brutality, and then, like a ghost, had simply vanished. The search for that ghost, a search that would stretch across decades and be filled with false leads, frustrating dead ends, and tantalizing clues, had just begun. The silence that fell over Beaumaris Beach that evening was a heavy one, filled with unanswered questions and the palpable presence of an injustice that cried out for resolution. The investigation into the murder of Victoria Cafasso became one of the largest and most complex in Tasmania's history. A team of detectives was assembled, and they began the painstaking work of trying to piece together a crime that had no apparent motive, no witnesses, and a killer who had left behind precious few clues. The initial missteps at the crime scene had been a significant blow, but the police were determined. They believed that someone in the small coastal community must know something, must have seen something, even if they didn't realize its significance. One of the most promising, and ultimately most enduring, leads emerged from the dozens of witness statements taken in the days and weeks following the murder. Several people reported seeing a distinctive, light-colored Subaru station wagon in the Beaumaris area on the morning of October 11th. The car was seen near the beach, parked at Freshwater Creek, the very spot where Victoria's body was found. More importantly, witnesses provided a description of the man seen driving the car. He was described as being in his 20s, about 6 feet tall, with a slim but very fit, athletic build. He had suntanned arms and legs, and the overall appearance of a surfer. A person matching that exact description was also seen running onto the beach around the time the murder was believed to have occurred. This surfer, in the Subaru, became the investigation's primary focus, a phantom-like figure who seemed to hold the key to the entire mystery. Who was he? Was he a local? A visitor? Was his presence on the beach that morning a coincidence, or was he the man who had so brutally attacked Victoria? Detectives fanned out across the East Coast, a region popular with surfers, showing the description to everyone they could find. They interviewed hundreds of people, chasing down every lead, every rumor, every whisper. Many local men who fit the description or owned a similar car were questioned. But the surfer remained elusive. He was a man without a name, a face without an identity. As the years passed, the investigation took on a life of its own, becoming a part of the local folklore. The case files grew thick with reports, statements, and dead-end leads. The murder weapon, believed to be a knife, was never found. Neither were Victoria's missing bikini bottoms, towel, or t-shirt, items the police believed the killer may have taken as some sort of sick trophy, or to dispose of evidence. The case was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Over time, several individuals emerged as persons of interest. One of them was a local doctor, Roman Hazel. Hazel was a controversial figure in the community, a man with a known history of violence and erratic behavior. He fit some aspects of the profile, and rumors swirled around him for years. Journalists and amateur sleuths, drawn to the mystery of the case, would later confront him, but he always denied any involvement, and police were never able to gather enough evidence to charge him. He was one of several suspects. A book written about the case in 2014 by author Melanie Calvert identified 3 archetypes: the fisherman, the biker, and the doctor, who were scrutinized, investigated, and ultimately, at least from an official standpoint, ruled out or left in a state of unresolved suspicion. For Victoria's family, the passing years were an agony. Her parents, consumed by grief, made the heartbreaking journey from Italy to Tasmania, a pilgrimage to the place where their daughter's life had been so violently stolen. They pleaded with the public for information, their faces etched with a pain that was impossible to comprehend. They could not understand how, in a place so beautiful, such an ugly thing could happen. They needed answers. They needed justice. But Tasmania held its secrets close. The family eventually returned to Italy, their lives forever fractured, the loss of their daughter a constant, open wound. In 2005, 10 years after the murder, a coronial inquest was held. It was a formal review of the case, a public airing of the evidence, the theories, and the failures of the investigation. The coroner's report was damning. It officially documented the brutal nature of Victoria's death, the bludgeoning, the 17 stab wounds, and confirmed that she had fought for her life. It also formally criticized the initial police response, highlighting the failure to properly secure the crime scene. But while the inquest provided a detailed account of what had happened to Victoria, it could not answer the one question that mattered most: who had done it? The inquest ended, as the investigation had, with no resolution. The case officially went cold. But a case like this is never truly cold, not for the detectives who inherit it, and certainly not for the community that lives in its shadow. The murder of Victoria Cafasso became a part of the identity of Tasmania's East Coast, a dark story told in hushed tones, a reminder of the day the innocence of their quiet corner of the world was shattered. The reward for information, initially set at $100,000, was a constant, public reminder that a killer was still at large. Decades passed. The world changed. Technology evolved in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1995. And in the quiet evidence lockers of the Tasmania police, the physical evidence from the Cafasso crime scene waited. In 2023, nearly 3 decades after the murder, a new team of cold case detectives decided to take a fresh look. They began the massive task of digitizing the old case files, hoping that modern technology could reveal something that had been missed. As they reviewed the evidence, their focus returned to that most persistent of clues: the surfer and the Subaru. Using modern software, they created reconstructed images and a video of the light-colored station wagon, releasing them to the public in a renewed appeal for information. They announced that the reward had been increased to $500,000. They believed that after all this time, allegiances may have shifted, relationships may have broken down, and someone who had held a secret for 30 years might finally be ready to talk. The new appeal did generate fresh leads. And it led the police to confirm something publicly for the first time. They had interviewed a man who matched the description of the surfer, and he remained a person of interest. The net, it seemed, was tightening, however slowly. They also made a specific and intriguing public plea. They asked for a person who had made an anonymous report to Crime Stoppers on December 28, 2024, to contact them again. The tipster had identified a person they suspected of a serious assault on a partner back in 1990. The police believed this information could be vital to the Cafasso case. It was a tantalizing hint that they were exploring links between the murder and other acts of violence, trying to build a profile of a killer who had likely not stopped with Victoria. Then, in October 2025, on the eve of the 30th anniversary of Victoria's death, Tasmania police made their most dramatic move yet. They announced that the reward for information leading to a conviction was being doubled to $1 million, the largest reward ever offered in the state's history. This was a random and particularly vicious attack committed on a young lady who was at the beginning of her life, Assistant Commissioner Adrian Bodner told the assembled media. For nearly a third of a century, the murderer has lived with this on their conscience. That must consume them. Someone must know something. 30 years. A lifetime. A baby born on the day Victoria Cafasso was murdered would now be a grown adult, perhaps with a family of their own. For 3 decades, a killer has walked free, carrying the weight of his terrible secret. He has aged, his life has moved on, while Victoria remains forever 20, a beautiful, smiling young woman in a faded photograph. The $1 million reward is a life-changing amount of money, a powerful incentive for someone to break a long-held silence. The case of Victoria Cafasso is no longer just a story about a brutal murder. It is a story about the relentless passage of time, about the enduring pain of a family, and about the unwavering determination of a police force that has refused to give up. It is a testament to the idea that there is no such thing as a perfect crime, only an unsolved one. The silence that has shrouded Beaumaris Beach for 30 years is not absolute. It is filled with whispers, with memories, with the lingering presence of an unquiet spirit. And now, with the promise of a record-breaking reward and the renewed focus of a new generation of investigators, there is a flicker of hope that the silence may finally be broken, and that justice, however belated, may finally be served for Victoria. The wind still sweeps across the white sands of Beaumaris Beach, but today it seems to carry a new message, a promise that the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, will one day be brought into the light. Story 8. In the heartland of America, in the small, unassuming city of Wisconsin Rapids, life moves with the steady, predictable rhythm of the seasons. It's a place of quiet neighborhoods, local bars where everyone knows your name, and a deep-seated sense of community. In the summer of 2006, this was the world of Deidre Christine Harm. At 21, she was a young woman just beginning to find her footing. She was a daughter, a friend, and most importantly, a new mother. Her life revolved around her infant daughter, a tiny, perfect life that had given her own a new and profound sense of purpose. Deidre, known to her friends as DC, was full of life, a bright, bubbly presence who was loved by all who knew her. Her future, like the long, sun-drenched days of that Wisconsin summer, seemed to stretch out before her, full of promise. The night of Saturday, June 10th, 2006, was warm and buzzing with the easy energy of a weekend. Deidre had arranged for a babysitter and was heading out for a night on the town with her friends. It was a well-deserved break, a chance to let her hair down and reconnect with the carefree parts of herself that motherhood had lovingly pushed to the side. The group made the familiar rounds of the downtown bars, places like the Body Shop and the Finish Line, their laughter echoing in the warm night air. A retired police officer, Scott Brem, would later recall seeing her at one of the bars, sharing a drink with some coworkers, a picture of youthful happiness. As the night wore on, the group began to splinter. Deidre was seen talking to a man she didn't seem to know, a stranger with an unfamiliar face. There was nothing overtly alarming about the interaction. It was just a typical scene in a crowded bar on a Saturday night. But as the clock ticked past midnight and into the early hours of Sunday, June 11th, a shadow began to fall. Deidre vanished. She didn't make it to the friend's house where she was supposed to spend the night. She didn't answer her phone. And most unnervingly, she didn't come home to her baby. The next morning, a seed of unease began to sprout among her family and friends. It wasn't like Deidre not to check in, not to come home to her daughter, not to be heard from or called to check in to see who's got her daughter. No friends, no relatives have been contacted by her, and it's just not Deidre, just not her. Her father, Scott Harm, would later lament. They filed a missing person report, their voices laced with a growing panic. But the initial police response was measured, almost dismissive. A 21-year-old out on a Saturday night, it was not, on its face, a cause for alarm. They assured the family she would likely turn up, nursing a hangover and a sheepish grin. But her family knew better. They knew something was terribly wrong. A mother doesn't just walk away from her child. Days turned into weeks, the summer sun beating down on a city that was now plastered with Deidre's smiling face on missing person flyers. The police investigation, now taking the disappearance more seriously, began to piece together her last known movements. They interviewed friends, coworkers, and bar patrons. The story of the unidentified man at the Finish Line bar began to take on a more sinister significance. Based on witness descriptions, a composite sketch was created and released to the public, the charcoal-drawn face of a ghost who held the key to Deidre's whereabouts. But the ghost remained elusive. The tips that came in led nowhere. The case, starved of any new leads, grew cold. The summer faded into autumn, and Deidre Harm was gone, swallowed by the silence of a single June night. For her family, it was the beginning of an agonizing, open-ended nightmare, a wait for an answer they both craved and dreaded. On November 20th, 2006, 5 months after Deidre vanished, the silence was broken by a horrific discovery. In a remote, wooded area in the town of Seneca, a place known to locals as Blueberry Ridge, a group of hunters stumbled upon human remains. The woods, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, had held a terrible secret. Dental records soon confirmed the family's worst fears. The remains belonged to Deidre Christine Harm. The missing person case was now a homicide. Forensic analysis revealed evidence of trauma. This was not an accidental death. Someone had brought her to this secluded spot and left her to be reclaimed by the forest. The discovery galvanized the investigation. The composite sketch of the man from the Finish Line bar became the central focus. Who was he? Was he a local? A visitor just passing through? His identity was the missing piece of a puzzle that had now taken on a terrible, tragic shape. But despite the renewed efforts, the trail remained stubbornly cold. The man in the sketch was a phantom, and Blueberry Ridge held its secrets close. Years passed. The world moved on. Deidre's daughter grew from an infant into a little girl, a living, breathing embodiment of the life that had been so cruelly stolen. For the Harm family, the grief was a constant, unwelcome companion, a dull ache that never subsided. But they refused to let their daughter be forgotten. They spoke her name, they shared her story, they kept the pressure on the investigators who, behind the scenes, never truly gave up on the case. They were waiting, as all cold case detectives do, for a break, a new piece of information, a call from a distant place that might finally shed a sliver of light on the darkness that had swallowed Deidre Harm. In the summer of 2009, that call would come, from a sheriff in a small town in Missouri, a man who was hunting a monster of his own. In the rugged, rolling hills of the Ozarks, in Douglas County, Missouri, another mother had vanished. In March 2007, Renee Williams, a 36-year-old mother of 3, disappeared after leaving the Eagle Lodge bar in Ava, Missouri, where she worked. The case landed on the desk of Douglas County Sheriff Chris DeGase. As he began to investigate, his focus quickly narrowed in on one man, Christopher Revick. Revick was a former EMT, a man whose profession was dedicated to saving lives. But beneath that veneer of respectability lay a dark and volatile nature. He was a man with a documented history of volatility, especially when he drank. And he had been at the Eagle Lodge bar on the night Renee Williams was last seen. Sheriff DeGase was a sharp, intuitive investigator. When I started working on the Christopher Revick case, he was my suspect in the murder of Renee Williams, DeGase would later say. I didn't think it was his first go-around at it. His gut told him he was dealing with something more than just a one-off crime. He was dealing with a predator. The investigation into Renee Williams' disappearance culminated in July 2009 with the arrest of Christopher Revick for her murder. Sheriff DeGase had his man. But his work was not done. He brought in Revik's wife, Johanna, for questioning. What she told him in the sterile quiet of the interrogation room would blow open not only the case of Renee Williams, but also the cold, forgotten case of a young mother in Wisconsin. Johanna, terrified and trapped in a marriage to a man she knew was a killer, finally broke her silence. She told Sheriff DeGace that she had come across a body and that Chris had told her it was an accident. But then the story changed. He had confessed the truth to her. There had been an argument outside a bar, and he had strangled a woman. But Johanna's confession didn't stop there. She told the sheriff that they had traveled to Wisconsin on several occasions. One of those trips, she confirmed, was in June of 2006, a trip to visit family in Wisconsin Rapids. Her husband's work records from his job as an EMT in Taney County, Missouri confirmed it. He was off from June 3rd through June 16th, 2006, the exact window of time when Deidre Harm had disappeared. A jolt went through Sheriff DeGace. He immediately contacted Investigator Becker in Wood County, Wisconsin. The pieces of two separate, distant puzzles began to snap together with a sickening click. The composite sketch of the man from the finish line bar was sent to Missouri. It was a perfect match for Christopher Revik. The ghost had a name. The day after he was charged with the second-degree murder of Renee Williams, before he could be questioned about the death of Deidre Harm, Christopher Revik made his final, selfish move. He hanged himself in his cell at the Douglas County Jail. He took his secrets with him to the grave, cheating two families out of the justice they so desperately deserved. The suicide of Christopher Revik was a devastating blow, but it was not the end of the story. For the next 16 years, investigators in both Wisconsin and Missouri painstakingly continued to build the case against a dead man. They had Johanna's chilling testimony. They had the confirmed timeline that placed Revik in Wisconsin Rapids on the night Deidre was murdered. Friends and family members recalled Revik returning from that trip with muddy clothes and a dirty truck that he had obsessively, immediately washed. And in the Renee Williams case, they had forensic evidence linking her to Revik's vehicle. For the Harm family, it was an agonizing limbo. They knew, with a certainty that settled deep in their bones, that Revik was the man who had killed their daughter. But the case remained officially open, a wound that could not be allowed to scar over. To the person or people responsible for the death of our beloved Deidre Christine Harm, they wrote in a statement that was both a plea and a curse. I want these words to be heard and felt. You did not just take a life, you shattered countless others. Finally, in October of 2025, after a final, thorough review of the nearly two-decade-old case file, Wood County District Attorney Jonathan Barnett made an official declaration. He announced that the investigation into the death of Deidre Harm was formally closed. Christopher Revik, he stated, was the man responsible. I believe I had enough to charge, and if Mr. Revik were still alive, when at trial, Barnett wrote in a letter to the sheriff. The announcement brought a measure of closure, but it could not heal the wound. First and foremost, words will never heal our hearts that have been forever broken, nor will they lessen the grief or the emptiness we feel every single day without her. Scott and Vegas Harm said in a statement that was read to the public. Their fight for their daughter was over, but their grief would be lifelong. The story of Deidre Harm is a testament to the dogged persistence of investigators who refuse to let a case go cold. But it is also a story with a deeply unsatisfying end, a story of justice denied. And it is perhaps a story with more chapters, a story with more victims. Sheriff Chris DeGace, the man who first saw the darkness in Christopher Revik, has always believed he was a serial killer, a man who used his job as a first responder as a cover for a sinister, predatory life. He has been investigated as a person of interest in the high-profile 1995 disappearance of Iowa News anchor Jody Husentritt and at least 2 other unsolved homicides. The ghost of Blueberry Ridge may have a name, but the full, terrifying scope of his crimes may never be known. He is a ghost who still haunts the cold case files of the American heartland, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can hide in plain sight.